National News Now.
So this war began on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas launched a series of coordinated, brutal terrorist attacks that killed over 1,200 Israeli citizens. Hamas intentionally publicized these attacks on social media to inflict trauma and seized over 200 hostages, gambling that Israel would be deterred from launching a counter-invasion out of fear of killing the hostages. The devastating nature of these attacks represented significant intelligence and military failures by the Israeli government, failures for which large portions of the electorate in Israel still demand political accountability for, specifically from the Netanyahu government. Israel quickly declared war against Hamas in the aftermath of these attacks, conducting an extensive military campaign of destruction and occupation in Gaza over the last 2 years. Israel also enforced a total blockade of the Gaza Strip, blocking the entry of food, water, medicine, fuel, and electricity. Its stated goal has been the destruction and disarmament of Hamas, the governing organization of Palestinians in Gaza. This military campaign has decimated Hamas and the people of Gaza, killing over 67,000 people there and injuring another 170,000, while displacing most of the population there. This means that over 11% of Gaza's pre-war population has been either killed or injured in the war. The United Nations estimates that over 95% of residential homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Israel also extended the war to target important regional supporters of Hamas, including Hezbollah and Iran. It launched attacks into southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah's military organization, and killed its leader in September of 2024. And then in June of this year, Israel launched a series of military attacks in conjunction with the United States that targeted Iran's nuclear facilities.
Okay, so why did Hamas start this war? One of the more accepted explanations focuses on Hamas's strategic calculations surrounding improved relations between Israel and Israel's Arab neighbors that enabled the Abraham Accords that were negotiated in the first Trump administration. Now, the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020 and marked a significant shift in Middle Eastern diplomacy and relations. Now, these agreements, brokered by the United States, normalized relations between Israel and the Arab states of the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. They established diplomatic ties, economic cooperation, and technological partnerships. Key provisions included mutual recognition, direct flights, trade agreements, and collaboration in sectors like energy, health, and security. Unlike previous peace deals, the accords did not require resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict first. Now, the Abraham Accords represented a breakthrough for Israel because it was able to normalize relations with surrounding Arab states without providing concessions on the Palestinian question. And Hamas was worried that this normalization process would extend to Saudi Arabia and undermine regional political support from Arab and Muslim states for Palestinian statehood. Therefore, the Hamas attacks of October 7th could be seen as a spoiling strategy to disrupt negotiations between Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States for closer ties and more cooperation. Now, more broadly, the devastating attack by Hamas against Israel was designed not only to disrupt normalization talks, but also to provoke an Israeli response that produced many Palestinian casualties. And because that response then could undermine Arab governments' ability to negotiate with Israel in the foreseeable future. So this was an attack that was driven arguably by political calculations and political motives surrounding the Palestinian issue and whether it could be maintained at the top of the agenda in Middle East politics.
Essentially, Hamas was trying to end its period of isolation and make it harder for the regional states in the region to cooperate with Israel. So next, we wanted to briefly discuss some of the key military and political developments over the last year of this war, beginning with key sources of political conflict between Israel and Hamas, right? And so Israel's core demands in this conflict have centered on security concerns and the return of hostages. These included the complete disarmament of Hamas and the dismantling of its military infrastructure so it could no longer launch terrorist strikes into Israel. Israel demanded the release of all living hostages and the return of the bodies of the deceased hostages. Israel also demanded the demilitarization of the Gaza Strip to prevent future attacks against Israel. Hamas, in turn, emphasized sovereignty and humanitarian relief, and its demands included the full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, the release of Palestinian prisoners held in Israel, the ending of the Israeli blockade of Gaza, and a substantial increase in humanitarian aid to address the severe crisis in the territory. So what has prevented peace in these 2 years of war, right? And because there have been repeated attempts at negotiations, what's prevented successful breakthroughs? The first core issue is one oriented around disarmament of Hamas. Israel has insisted on the complete surrender of Hamas's weapons as a precondition for ending the war. Hamas consistently rejected this demand, viewing its arsenal as essential leverage. However, some recent reports sourcing negotiations from Arab states suggest that there's a growing willingness by at least parts of Hamas to consider partial disarmament. The other thing that's important to recognize in the ceasefire that's been negotiated and publicized over the last week, they've essentially massaged this issue of Hamas, of the disarmament of. It's phase two, and they've talked about disarmament, demobilization. It's unclear in terms of the scope of or the number of weapons that Hamas will actually have to, and whether they will actually surrender it to international forces Israeli. The devil here is in the details.
Right. And how do you enforce that, and how do you monitor and make sure that that actually takes place? Yeah. All of those things are pretty complicated and hard to.
Yes. And because what Hamas is going to say is that these weapons are its only device to ensure that Israel complies with its obligations in any long-term peace deal. Right. Another key source, unresolved question, is who would govern Gaza after the conflict. Hamas has sought to retain a role in any future administration of Gaza, while Israel opposed any arrangement that allowed Hamas's political authority and repeatedly said, and expressed a willingness to occupy Gaza to prevent any government led by Hamas or with any government that had participation from Hamas.
Yeah, this is the day after problem, right? Like what happens in Gaza after there's some sort of ceasefire or withdrawal from the territory by the Israeli government, like what entity is going to govern and maintain order, right? And there's a ton of complications around this, and so I'm sure we'll get to that.
Yet to be determined, right? Over the negotiations in Egypt will begin to touch on this issue. Another source of constraint or that limited the ability to have sustainable peace settlement is domestic political complications in Israel. Far-right members of Netanyahu or Israel's governing coalition, notably Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, advocated for the reoccupation of Gaza and settlement expansion throughout the war. And so Netanyahu has resisted some ceasefire proposals, partly to prevent making concessions to Hamas that could cause his governing coalition to collapse. And then finally, the fate of the Israeli hostages has remained really the central, I would argue, the central issue in the resolution of the conflict. Israel has long demanded their immediate release, while Hamas viewed them as its primary bargaining tool, delaying concessions and leveraging the hostages until it could secure greater concessions from Israel.
Okay, so that's all the complications. Now we want to briefly identify a series of key developments in Israel's military operations over the past year, and this discussion provides some essential background that helps us understand what enabled the diplomatic breakthrough of the last month. Now, the period from late 2024 through September 2025, right around now, was marked by significant escalations in the Israel-Hamas conflict. And those escalations were enabled by Israel's efforts to strike Hamas's regional allies and shift the regional balance of military power into Israel's favor by depriving Hamas of additional support from its allies. So on October 17, 2024, Israel weakened the leadership structure of Hamas by killing its leader, Yahya Sinwar, in an attack. It was kind of a fortuitous for Israel event, right? During military operations against Hezbollah in Lebanon, so this is a different adversary, an ally of Hamas, Israel killed its leaders in September and October of 2024. So it was undermining and weakening Hezbollah. And Hezbollah and Israel later signed a ceasefire agreement in November, on November 27th, to be precise, in 2024, that ended a year of fighting on Israel's northern front. Now, this allowed Israel to redirect military resources to Gaza. And then in the final stages of his presidency, the Biden administration helped negotiate a temporary ceasefire between Israel and Hamas that went into effect in January of 2025. It included multiple rounds of prisoner exchanges that enabled the resumption of humanitarian aid into Gaza. Then on March 18th of 2025, Israel ended that ceasefire with a surprise attack across Gaza and resumed military operations that were designed to disarm Hamas and occupy Gaza. In May, Israel escalated its campaign by initiating what was called Operation Gideon's Chariots, aimed at gaining full control of the Gaza Strip. Now, this expansion drew sharp criticism from international actors, with the United Kingdom, France, and Canada threatening sanctions. By early August, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved a plan to occupy Gaza City, prompting condemnation from the United Nations and key allies, including Germany. Now, these developments underscored growing diplomatic isolation for Israel as the conflict intensified. In the summer of 2025, Israel conducted a series of strikes on Iranian military facilities, targeting sites linked to missile development and arms transfers to proxy groups like Hamas. These actions were framed by Israel as necessary to prevent escalation beyond Gaza, but they reverberated through the negotiation process. The strikes hardened positions among Hamas and its regional backers, who viewed them as evidence of Israel's broader strategic ambitions. Arab and Muslim states already engaged in ceasefire discussions expressed concern that the conflict could widen. This led Qatar and other mediators to push for stronger security guarantees during the September UN meetings, including assurances against further regional strikes. On August 20th, Israel began its Gaza City offensive, mobilizing approximately 60,000 Israeli reservists. This marked one of the largest troop developments of the war. On September 16th, Israel launched its full-scale ground offensive into Gaza City, signaling a decisive phase in its military strategy. Now, this timeline illustrates the interplay between military operations and diplomatic pressures. These events set the stage for the September and October negotiations that ultimately produced a ceasefire agreement. So the escalation had a huge impact on all of this.
So now we want to turn to the diplomatic activity of the last month, and I want to emphasize the importance of a shock that was created by Israel's attempted assassination of the leaders of Hamas, who were in Qatar in September, and they were there for diplomatic talks to end the war. Israel attempted to assassinate these leaders in their residential compounds on September 9th of 2025, right? And this is part of the broader significant escalation of Israeli military operations that had begun in Gaza in August. So on September 9th, Israel attacks leaders of Hamas in residential neighborhood in Doha, Qatar. This attack temporarily halts the ceasefire talks, and the Qataris then, less than a week later, convene emergency talks of Arab and Muslim states. And they construct a list of demands to include in the talks, and they basically argue and they tell the United States and American mediators that Israel had gone too far. This undermined the ability of Qatar to mediate the conflict, and it was taken as another sign of Israeli escalation that was targeting regional players. It's important to emphasize, too, that the Trump administration was outraged by Netanyahu's attacks on the leaders of Hamas and the negotiators in Qatar. The Trump administration didn't know about this. Its delegates didn't know about this, and there was a sharp condemnation, particularly privately, immediately after these assassination attacks. Okay, so the assassination attacks generates new momentum from the Palestinian allies in the region, Arab and Muslim states, to begin to put more pressure on the United States to pressure Netanyahu to step back from the escalation that Israel had undertaken in this war dating back to August of this year. So the talks then moved to New York for the UN meetings. On September 20th, the Qatari Prime Minister presents a series of demands to U.S. negotiators, saying that it needs a promise that Israel won't strike Qatar again. In other words, the U.S. needs to actively restrain Israel. And Qatar also signals, though, that in its talks with Arab states, there's been a movement in that there's a greater willingness now to police Gaza, to construct an international stabilization force for the day after if a ceasefire arrangement can be arranged. Qatar also signals, and negotiators also signal to the United States that there are new signs that Hamas will disarm. Okay? On September 23rd, we have the Trump meetings at the United Nations, and this is an important set of meetings because there's movement in Trump's position, the movement in the position of the American administration, and there's a greater willingness to integrate important parts of the demands from Arab and Muslim states on September 15th into Trump's 20-point peace plan. Most importantly, perhaps, is that the Arab and Muslim states press Trump at these UN meetings to demand concessions from Netanyahu. They tell Trump, you've got to pressure Netanyahu to get concessions. And at these meetings, from sources, there is a clear commitment by Trump to essentially pressure Netanyahu to make the concessions. So at these meetings at the UN, Trump signals he's now willing to restrain Netanyahu and force him to the bargaining table and force him, essentially politically force him to agree to ceasefire terms. On September 24th, Secretary of State Marco Rubio presents the leaders of the Arab Muslim states with a written version of this peace plan. And then on September 25th, delegates of the administration begin the hard work of pressuring Netanyahu to accept the terms of the peace plan. Sources indicate that Trump's key delegates here, Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, engage in a series of tense meetings with Netanyahu in New York City. They say talks will continue on September 28th, but these were tense and conflictual talks. The talks continue. There's a disagreement about whether or not Netanyahu is invited to the White House by the Trump administration or Netanyahu invites himself. But most importantly, on September 29th, Trump and Netanyahu announce a peace deal at the White House. Significantly, this occurs after President Trump, we can say, forces Netanyahu to call the Qatari Prime Minister and apologize to the Qatari Prime Minister for Israel attacks against Qatar and against Hamas negotiators at the beginning of September.
There's photos that suggested that. Yeah.
This is not just the photos were intentional, right? The Trump calls in the White House photographers, says you're going to take a picture of Netanyahu calling the Qatari prime minister and apologizing. So there was
holding the phone. And,
yes.
Yeah.
So there is a record of this, and this is partly also signal, right, to Arab and Muslim states in the region that Trump is pressuring Netanyahu, and the games have changed. This is if we look at least the history of the ceasefire that's been written now by contemporary journalists, this period from September 9th to September 29th, that 3-week period that's started by Israel's attack in Qatar, and that ends with this apology that's forced by President Trump, that this is where the key breakthroughs come diplomatically. Okay?
Right. So that attack, which is arguably it was an overreach by Israel, creates this opening that actually, if you think about the narrative you just presented, was an opening that provided movement on both sides, right? It provided a initiative from the Trump administration to restrain Israel, because it agreed that Israel went too far. And so he played his part to bring Israel to a better negotiating position. But then these Arab and Muslim states also started talking about their side of the conflict, Hamas, and what to do in the day after in terms of governing, knowing that ending this conflict is one other way to constrain Israel, right? Yes. And so that is what happened.
Yeah, and it's important it's important to recognize too that during these talks, Trump makes concessions to the Arab and Muslim states to incorporate some of their demands in his 20-point peace plan.
Right.
Okay, so we get the announcement of these terms, and then we get the pressure on Hamas. Will you accept the ceasefire terms? And pressure on Israel, because Netanyahu signaled that he will, but now the Israeli parliament needs to. And so this is what happens in the next 10 days. October 9th, Israel and Hamas agree to the ceasefire terms. On October 10th, the Israeli parliament approves the ceasefire terms, and the ceasefire goes into effect. The bombing stops, and on Friday, the Israeli military begins its pullback to designated new lines in Gaza Strip. It's not complete evacuation from Gaza, but about half of the territory it moved back from. And then, once the fighting stopped, the clock starts on the timeline, a 72-hour timeline to release the remaining hostages on Sunday, October. And at this point, Israel and the world didn't know how many remaining survivors were left of the hostages. Hamas confirms on Sunday that there were 20 hostages that were still alive, and they confirmed that they would be released to representatives of the Red Cross on Monday morning at 10:13, October 13th. And this transfer did take place this morning to celebrations in Israel. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
So this shift to, will Hamas agree? I mean, this is kind of the way I read the news coverage on this. Hamas agrees kind of conditionally and partially, and that could have disrupted the whole thing, but Trump, the way they covered it, Trump just took it as full agreement and pushed forward, and that helped to do this. And the other thing that they note is that Israel and Netanyahu was under immense pressure to agree to the 20-point plan, but one of the reasons that Netanyahu agreed was he thought Hamas was going to reject it. And then he thought it was going to be safe to agree to this, and then Hamas rejects, and then he's off the hook. But then when Hamas partially agrees and Trump keeps just pushing forward, then it sticks, which is the way a lot of these negotiations go. It could have went a different way.
Yeah, and I think the thing that's, I want to emphasize another important part of your point here, and you're going to see this in one of the videos that we're going to show you in a second. So Trump takes partial agreement from Hamas and says they accepted everything. So he then puts pressure on Hamas to accept everything, because then they get blamed if they don't. But now in the public, and you're going to see this in the video, the public proclamation from the leader of Hamas that they're accepting of the terms, they basically say this is peace, but then they put the burdens back on Trump. This is a U.S. guaranteed peace, right? This is the end of the war. We have accepted the terms, but this is a U.S. guaranteed peace. And so the diplomatic game is going back and forth here. Right. So more broadly, right, we see a significant breakthrough here, a diplomatic breakthrough here that starts with Israel's failed assassination attempt. It provokes outrage in the region, and it provokes outrage in the Trump administration and by President Trump as well. This creates new pressure on Netanyahu to end the war. Trump incorporates Arab demands into the process, okay? And so now we're gonna watch a summary video from PBS highlighting this breakthrough and giving you a few more details here. Let's go ahead and watch that clip.
Welcome to the NewsHour. Israel and Hamas have signed the agreement that President Trump proposed to pause their devastating 2-year war. Under the terms, Hamas will release all 20 living hostages in the coming days in exchange for Palestinian prisoners, while the Israeli military will begin pulling back but stay inside Gaza.
Tonight, the Pentagon announced that the U.S. is sending 200 troops to help, quote, support and monitor the peace deal. But uncertainty remains about some of the thornier aspects of the plan, such as whether and how Hamas will disarm and who will govern Gaza. Nick Schifrin has that report.
In Gaza City today, medics make their way to a central square, but not to rescue. Instead, to celebrate and savor the sweetness of what they hope is no more war.
Honestly, these are indescribable feelings. We can't believe it, but thank God the war has ended and we're alive.
45 miles to the north in Tel Aviv, singing and group hugs. Gil Dickman has been leading protests in the city's hostage square. His cousin, Carmel Gat, was killed in Hamas captivity last August.
She's not going to come back. It's too late for her, but it's not too late for 48 hostages who are going to come back. 20 of them are going to come back alive.
Both sides today portrayed victory. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met his government with U.S. negotiators Ambassador Steve Witkoff and senior advisor Jared Kushner. And Hamas's Gaza head, Khalil al-Haya, described today's agreement as the U.S. guaranteed end of the war.
We have received guarantees from the mediating brothers and from the American administration, all of whom confirm that the war has ended completely.
Over the next 24 hours, the Israeli military will withdraw to this yellow line inside of Gaza, giving them control of 53% of the strip. Within 72 hours after that, Hamas must release all 48 living and deceased hostages, 20 of whom are believed to still be alive. Israel has also agreed to release nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners. The deal was sealed overnight in an Egyptian conference room with representatives from Egypt, Qatar, Turkey, and Hamas. Today, Witkoff and Kushner also met Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi and envisioned a broader regional peace.
I really hope that what we were able to accomplish over the last months and particular days doesn't just end this war, but also has the opportunity to continue what we worked on last time, to bring the countries of the region closer together.
And all Americans should be proud of the role that our country has played in bringing this terrible conflict to an end.
At a White House cabinet meeting, President Trump called the deal momentous.
Much involved. I've never seen anything quite like it. But it's really peace in the Middle East.
On Sunday, President Trump will head to Israel, where some are ready to give him a hero's welcome.
I love you, Trump.
All right, let me make a few comments here. First, let's talk about the important terms of the peace, specifically the first phase of the peace. Hamas releases the Israeli hostages, and at the same time, Israel releases Palestinian prisoners. This exchange of hostages and prisoners is an important part of the resolution of this conflict. And so that was a crucial development. Second, the ceasefire. The fighting stops with this ceasefire, and if they can maintain this ceasefire, that's the second huge development here that ends what has been a very destructive and devastating conflict, particularly for the Palestinians in Gaza. And then thirdly, Israel and its military withdraws from a large part of the Gaza Strip. This is all just phase one of the deal. There are outlines for phase two of the peace negotiation, but that is still, the details of that phase two is still awaits a whole round of tougher negotiations that begin in Egypt pretty much immediately. Now, second, I think it's important to note, as this clip does, is the important role of the United States in this peace settlement. We already talked about how Arab states in the Middle East pressured the Trump administration and President Trump himself to apply pressure to Prime Minister Netanyahu to stop the fighting. The leader of Hamas described the agreement, as you saw in the clip, as the U.S. guaranteed end of the war. President Trump is investing a lot of political capital here to end the conflict and creating significant expectations that he will follow up on this breakthrough with continued U.S. commitments. The regional players expect the Trump administration to guarantee that Israel will continue to stop the fighting, won't resume it. And note to this end that his administration is deploying American troops to Israel to help monitor the implementation of the ceasefire.
Can I just briefly note the comparison here in Gaza versus Ukraine, right? And the shift, right? And we see this in talks on all the parties about how important it was for some form of security guarantee on the part of the United States to end the conflict. Note that the U.S. is providing it here, not yet willing to do that in Ukraine. It's important to draw the comparison here, right? And that's a story about the political and strategic calculations made by the administration.
Right, and it's a story about how wars end, or especially wars like this end. You don't stop fighting until there's a security guarantee that's going to help both sides, tolerate an end of the fighting and not think it's just a surrender, right? And so, okay, so the third thing that I want to note here is that there has been a significant outpouring of support and appreciation for President Trump in Israel. We see that in the final portion of the clip. He is enormously popular in Israel right now. He's receiving a lot of support for ending the war, both by pressuring Netanyahu and engaging with the regional intermediaries that helped pressure Hamas to stop the fighting. And so this is a kind of triumphal moment for President Trump. And it is a real breakthrough, and we'll talk more about how it was, accomplished, but it's a moment, I think, for him. Now, the big question is what happens a month from now, several months from now, if something falls apart. But right now, it's a huge accomplishment.
And this is where we're going to next, because we got important components to stop fighting, exchange of hostages, and evacuation by military forces. But now, really, the hard work for peace begins. And now the question about will the United States, because it has created expectations that it's going to be involved and it's going to essentially act as a commitment device to keep Israel from fighting. Now the question is whether the United States will invest those resources. You could make an argument that moving 200 U.S. troops to Israel, not to Gaza, to Israel is a sign of that commitment. But what we want to work through now is the broader 20-point plan. Why are some of these elements in there? How are they? What are the challenges associated with negotiating them? And how are they going to help structure this peace? So as we've noted, the ceasefire only include terms for some of the elements of Trump's 20-point plan. And a last element must incorporate an extensive list of additional components that will reassure both sides that their opponent will stop fighting, and to create a the last components here to create a lasting peace. You have to reassure both sides so they stop fighting. You got to create a governing authority for Gaza that ensures peace there, and by doing that, prevent a future Israeli occupation of the enclave. So these are some of the broad strategic goals that have to be accomplished with this process. How's the 20-point plan going to do that? So let's work through some of these components, right? So first, Israel ends military operations. That happened last Friday. We have a phased withdrawal of Israeli military forces from Gaza, ultimately leaving a buffer zone. Right? Israel completes the first phase of those operations on 10/10 last Friday, and then there's going to be successive withdrawals. We have a prisoner exchange that was administered by the Red Cross. We've already talked about that. That was executed this morning. We have an aid surge into Gaza, 600 trucks per day, that's being administered by the United Nations. That supposedly was to begin right as well. Okay. Now we're going to move to the second, more complicated phases. And here is where we can see the role that the mediators in September from other Arab and Muslim states played in this process. They got incorporated in Trump's peace plan the idea that there would be no forced expulsions of Palestinians from Gaza. This was one of the big concerns in negotiations this year. Would Netanyahu, would potentially Trump support the movement of large proportions of the Palestinian population from Gaza? No, there's a commitment in the 20-point plan that there will be no forced expulsions of Palestinians from Gaza. This was a key thing that mediators from Arab and Muslim states demanded.
And this is a bit of a change,
yes,
right, for the Trump administration. There was some comments made. I mean, he makes lots of comments that, are off the cuff about moving Palestinians out of Gaza in earlier time,
yes,
in earlier
and when
periods of this.
Floated the Gaza Riviera or whatever.
Stuff, yes.
This is where the concern about whether he would back such a plan by Israel. And so effectively, what the mediators they pressured Trump into including this component that was really important to them. Second, another important of the second, there's going to be a temporary technocratic interim leadership of Gaza. Who's going to be appointed that? It's unclear. The idea is you might think of this as managing mayors that are going to guide the reconstruction and negotiate with international agencies that are designed to reconstruct Gaza and to try and provide political stability there. There's going to be a creation of an international stabilization force. It's unclear what that's going to look like, what states are going to participate in it, but you might think about this as the local police organization in Gaza. It will be made of international troops, and the idea here is so that Gaza can't reconstitute itself, and Hamas won't be responsible for providing security in Gaza.
Actually, it's also not going to be Israel.
Yes, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. And this international stabilization force will also be there to monitor settlement terms. There's a commitment in there. Again, remember, both sides agreed to this. There's a provision in there that Israel won't annex new territories. So this could potentially create a problem in Netanyahu's coalition because he's got far-right ministers that want to incorporate territories in the West Bank and in Gaza. But left to negotiate in the next stage is the terms of disarmament. How extensive will Hamas disarm? Hamas, there was incorporated in the provisions that Hamas, if they put down, members of Hamas, if they put down their weapons, they will be granted amnesty. Or if they are unwilling to put down their weapons, they have to find a place of exile and move to another government. But this is part of the more broadly, the terms of disarmament of Hamas. These are still going to have to be negotiated. Two-state solution. Is there a two-state solution? The final point of the 20-point plan acknowledges the demand and the interest in a two-state solution. This is a concession to Palestinians, to Arab and Muslim states, but Trump is massaging a difficult point here because there isn't majority political support for a two-state solution in Israel. And so this document signals that he's not yet willing to pressure Netanyahu to force him to abide by this. The peace plan talks about reforming in the long run. There's going to be this temporary technocratic government, but actually reforming and creating the conditions for reforming the Palestinian Authority that governs the West Bank, getting political reforms on the Palestinian Authority so they can ultimately govern Gaza. And then another really important military component of all this is left to be negotiated is how are the rest of the tunnels going to be destroyed in Gaza? Right. Israel is insisting on the complete destruction of all the tunnels, Hamas's tunnels, to an order that they can demobilize and that the territory can't be used for future attacks. The devil's in the details about how that's going to be engineered.
But just think about all of these additional commitments and developments that have to be ironed out. This is not a short-term process. This is literally going to take years to accomplish any of the real broad things. And so
and that also means, right, a period of vulnerability at which point, if Hamas isn't disarmed, then factions within it could resume terrorist strikes against Israel.
Right. And then the whole cycle could start again. And that's how, the longer that the ceasefire maintains itself, the more momentum it will have to continue to operate, and the more pressure there's going to be even within those rebel groups in among Palestinians to restrain, right? And so the beginning part is going to be the crucial one, and they're going to and I think a lot of effort's going to go into maintaining that ceasefire so it doesn't just collapse. And
can I add one thing on the ceasefire too here? So we've been talking about a ceasefire between Hamas and the Israeli military. The other thing that's happened over the weekend, and this has been going on, is you have the outbreak of military attacks and fighting within Gaza between Palestinians that are resisting Hamas's rule. And so on Sunday, there were at least 30 people had been killed in attacks by militias that were trying to disarm and undermine Hamas's ability to reconstitute itself. Wow. So there is the beginnings of this little civil war that, again, will require, this is why this international stabilization force that's so important, right, to not only to separate Israel and Hamas, but also potentially to create peace in Gaza as well, among Palestinians.
Right. Okay, so let's go on to the next topic here. Next, we're going to briefly address the question of why peace was accomplished now. And we want to emphasize a few things. We want to conclude this timeline by drawing your attention to a few things that have helped create the conditions for the October ceasefire. First, the sustained Israeli military campaign destroyed much of Gaza while decimating Hamas as a military organization. And we want to give you a better sense of this destruction with another brief clip from ABC News that discusses the ceasefire. So go ahead and run that clip now.
This morning, U.S. troops have arrived in Israel to monitor a fragile ceasefire in Gaza. Officials say the troops will help with logistics and coordinate planning and security in the region as work to implement the next phase of the peace agreement gets underway. Officials stressing the 200 troops will not go into Gaza, where more than 24 hours into the ceasefire, the guns are still silent. This is an indescribable day, Ali Rihan says. Today the war has ended, God willing. And families displaced from their homes once again heading north, returning to what is left of their lives. But most of Gaza is in ruins. The UN says 92% of the buildings here have either been damaged or destroyed in the 2-year-long war. While in Israel, families of the 48 held hostage by Hamas anxiously wait to be reunited with their loved ones. 20 are believed to still be alive. Itzhak Horn's 2 sons were taken by Hamas. One has been returned, while the other is believed to be among the 20 living hostages. Horn telling our Ian panel that while he is happy, part of him remains unsure because, quote, I know who we are dealing with here. Officials signaling the release could happen at any time as the 72-hour deadline to release the hostages approaches. Israeli forces have partially withdrawn to the Yellow Line, making way for Hamas to begin the process of returning the hostages, both the living and the dead. Israel threatening to resume its heavy bombardment on the enclave if the hostages are not released by the deadline. President Trump now preparing to visit the region early next week, expected to meet with Israeli officials and later host a summit of world leaders in Egypt, marking the end of a vicious war that, according to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry, has claimed the lives of more than 67,000 people in Gaza.
And this ceasefire calls for the immediate surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza. As UN-backed experts say, more than 500,000 Palestinians are starving. Now, that's something Israel denies. And Janae, so much is unknown about the future of this truce. One key question is whether Hamas will agree to disarm. Janae.
All so incredibly fragile, Marcus. Thank you for that update.
All right. Now, note the discussion of the toll that this conflict has taken on Gaza. Over 67,000 people are dead. Over 95% of homes in Gaza were damaged or destroyed. Gaza is now home to basically 40 million tons of rubble. And if reconstruction agencies relied on 100 trucks daily to clear the rubble from Gaza, it's reported that it would take 15 years to complete that job. And so you saw the pictures of the tens of thousands of Gazans who were displaced and are now returning to what is left of their homes. Most importantly, these military operations raise the cost to Hamas and the people of Gaza for continuing that war. So over the weekend, we saw evidence of this growing domestic pressure on Hamas as local militias in Gaza launched attacks on Hamas, as Professor McDonald noted. So second, the regional expansion of the war enabled significant Israeli military victories over both Hezbollah and Iran and created regional new pressures from the Gulf states on the United States to pressure Netanyahu for peace. Israel successfully leveraged the war to limit external support from Hamas, but it simultaneously generated growing unease among regional states like Qatar and Egypt, with which it holds working relationships. So that escalation kind of had this dual effect. It provided some room for Israel to shift to an end of the war with Hamas because it took away its support from Hezbollah and Iran by beating them, or at least, having some serious victories over them. Israel felt more secure to do this. And at the same time, by escalating as much as they did, it made them so isolated that they had to really end the war too, especially when the Trump administration started pressuring them to do so, because they only had the Trump administration. And so that explains the leverage. It had two effects. Okay, third, the 2024 election outcomes in the United States and the diplomatic maneuvering by the Trump administration helped end the war. Initially, the reorientation of U.S. foreign policy in January 2025 encouraged the Netanyahu government to end a ceasefire brokered by the Biden administration and escalate the military operations to secure more concessions from Hamas. Netanyahu leveraged U.S. support to launch a bold attack against Iran and remake the distribution of power in the Middle East. However, after that attack against Iran, international outrage at Israel continued escalation of the conflict, particularly through the attack against Hamas leadership in Qatar, also created new leverage for the Trump administration to pressure both sides back to the negotiating table. And finally, President Trump decided to spend lots of his own political capital in securing a ceasefire. He worked closely with Arab and Muslim mediators. He incorporated some of their political demands in his peace plan, and then put the necessary pressure on Netanyahu to end the conflict. And so a lot of factors come into play here to get to this point.
Yeah, and I think the other thing to keep in mind is we're only 3 days into this story. And so this is a tentative outline of what the conversation is about in public outlets right now. We're going to have to let historians decide 5 to 10, 15 years from now, after all the interviews, in terms of what's the principal cause for this peace. We don't even know if the peace is going to land, but I would expect that there's going to be significant conversations about, is this a function of the war's outcomes? Is this a function of the changing regional dynamics? Is this a function of the American election and the change in the administration's posture from the Biden administration to the Trump administration? I don't think we're making a case at which any one of these things caused the war. It's just giving you some sense of this is the debate, and I suspect that these alternatives will play a role in this debate as it moves forward, as it becomes an academic debate in the next 10 and 15 years. All right, so in this final section of the session today, we want to think more about what all this means for the region and the prospects for a long-lasting peace. I thought there was a really good comment on this on Fareed Zakaria's GPS program on CNN from yesterday. So we want to run that clip and just use it as a way to finish up our conversation today.
But first, here's my take. Donald Trump is often called a transactional president, and this week that apt description led to success. The ceasefire negotiated between Israel and Hamas was a transaction, and a complicated one at that. It's worth placing all the caveats that this is only phase one and it may break down or get stuck if the parties renege on their commitments. But the first phase is in fact a plausible pathway to ending the horrific violence in Gaza and represents a chance well worth taking. It also reveals 5 important realities about the Middle East today. First, Israel is in a commanding position of strength. Dan Sinner, the Republican analyst and author, noted on GPS last week that the deal was an Israeli plan, or at least an American plan that Israelis could live with. Well, Israel is the power on the ground, and it's become more powerful in the last 2 years as it has defeated an array of its enemies abroad. Nothing is going to happen without its consent. As a practical matter, if you want Israel's guns to stop firing, you need a plan that Israel can live with. Indeed, Israel's rise has been so dramatic that both Qatar and Saudi Arabia have begun warily to balance against that strength. Doha seeking military guarantees from Washington, and Riyadh signing a mutual defense pact with Pakistan, a nuclear-armed nation. Second, you can get concessions from Israel, but it takes political capital and skill. President Trump used both intelligently in getting Benjamin Netanyahu to accept the deal. Trump has huge political capital with Israelis, and he used it to pressure Netanyahu. He seized the moment when Israel's attack on Hamas operatives in Doha produced lots of blowback in the region. And he took Hamas's partial acceptance of the plan and pretended it was a full embrace, even though the Israelis had begun to balk, forcing the deal to a close. Third, you see in the negotiations the reality of the new Middle East. Look at who was in the negotiating room for the deal. Egyptians, Turks, Israelis, Qataris, and Americans, along with Hamas. The Egyptians are important only in this particular context because of their border with Gaza and the Rafah crossing, which is a key corridor for flooding aid into Gaza. They represent in some ways the old Middle Eastern order, dominated by the large, populous, and culturally rich countries like Egypt, Syria, and Iraq. The new Middle East is dominated by Israel and the Gulf states. Nowhere is that more evident than in the rise of Qatar, a tiny gas-rich kingdom with just around 400,000 citizens, but a shrewd leadership that is willing to talk to all parties, including Iran and Hamas, which makes them indispensable in any conflict mediation. Where the old Middle East was led by the large states that espoused pan-Arabism and encouraged Palestinian terrorism, the Gulf kingdoms searched for modernity, technological advancement, and above all, peace and stability. Turkey is the new wild card, strong, but ruled by a willful leader who has flirted with Islamic radicalism. Fourth, the new Middle East is one where the Iranian threat has weakened considerably. Ever since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, the Arab states have worried about an expansionist, ideologically aggressive Iran. But over the last 15 years or so, Iran has been in economic misery and periodically convulsed by political crises, from a green movement to widespread protests from the women's movement to divisions within its ruling elite. Through all of this, Iran faced a series of devastating Israeli attacks on its nuclear scientists, military leaders, and nuclear facilities, culminating in the attacks in June, which was so comprehensive as to be almost akin to an invasion. Finally, despite all the violence, extremism, and animosity, there is really no long-term plan that doesn't end with some kind of a two-state solution. The veteran American diplomat, Martin Indyk, who was passionately pro-Israel and also in favor of a Palestinian state, wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs last year, a few months before his tragic death, titled The Strange Resurrection of the Two-State Solution. He argued in it that decades of abandonment of that objective have only proven that there is no alternative. Every other alternative, continued occupation, one state, expulsion, doesn't really work. So people will eventually, reluctantly, come back to it. But that will only happen now if President Trump comes to it himself and invests it with his power and energy. His plan makes a small reference to it. But in announcing the ceasefire, he hoped not just for a ceasefire, but for everlasting peace, quote unquote. That would require more than a transaction. It would require vision. The fruits of that vision, genuine and lasting peace, would echo through history and would constitute a prize much larger even than the one awarded by the Nobel Committee every October.
All right. Couple things here. I get a kick out of how Zakaria is trying to nudge administration officials at the end there. This is your chance at greatness, right? It's a very supportive piece, says it's transformational, but then, right, he wants to nudge his own political views, which is you have an opportunity, but it has to include the two-state solution, right? Something that the administration is yet to signal whether it is, will support. So one thing that jumps out to me, both from the conflict and this video, is the lasting consequences of this war for resetting the distribution of power in the Middle East. Not only the distribution of power, but the distribution of interest. The war has created a larger political shock, and we don't know yet what the political order that will evolve from this system. But it's definitely a big change, one that might create a pathway to peace, whereby you get this growing cooperation, economic cooperation between the Gulf states and Israel, right? But the cost of that is the reducing salience of the Palestinian issue, and so we shouldn't forget about this. You know, one question is, what's the content of the order, and is it peaceful or violent? Another question is about, is it a just situation? And if war becomes the shock to remake the political order, this war in particular, we can't forget the enormous humanitarian consequences for the Palestinian people in Gaza, right? One of the numbers that stuck out to me is 11% of the population was either killed or injured in this war. That is significant, and we can't downplay, and we need to recognize the national horror that the hostage situation and the attacks created in Israel as well. The part of the shock here is the shift in Israeli politics that were also created by this intense vulnerability and outrage by the attacks on Hamas on Israeli citizens. That created the political momentum in Israel to fight a long war and to pay the cost of fighting a long war.
Yeah, and so this war remakes the Middle East. I'm going to emphasize the fact that the expansion of the war to Hezbollah and to Iran in particular really was instrumental, kind of in an ironic way, to ending the conflict in Gaza, right? In the sense that by taking the war and expanding it to Iran in particular, what Israel was able to do is to severely weaken Iran so that that threat and the support that it gives Hamas and that lifeline that it gives Hamas and other regional actors like Hezbollah in the region, the Houthis too, gets removed from the scene. And with that, Israel can feel a bit more secure in ending a conflict against Hamas, knowing that Iran can't help it rebuild itself with arms transfers and all sorts of things, right? And so at the time, it seemed there were a lot of risks to that escalation, and it was hard to see how that escalation would, months later, result in the end of this conflict, or at least contribute to the result of the end of this conflict. And so it's an interesting interplay between escalation and the end of a war.
And let me add something else, the shock, the unexpected nature of the shock that's related to this. If we go back to October of 2023, when the war started, what does the Biden administration do? It sends aircraft carriers over there and issues a series of deterrent threats because they were expecting regional players to pile on and side with Hamas and take significant territory from Israel. And there were concerns that Israel gets overrun. And so the Biden administration says, we support Israel. They move military assets to the region to deter attacks by other non-Hamas actors.
Right.
What does Israel demonstrate in this war? That they could do it on their own, right? In a sense that, there is, and I shouldn't say do it completely on their own, but there is a resetting of the expectations and estimates about Israeli military strength that's been a product of this war. 2023, the United States is worried about Israel getting overrun by a coalition of these states. What did Israel do through this war? It dismantled that coalition through military strikes and military victories. That as well is going to play a significant role in resetting the political order of the region.
But it also poses a threat to its neighbors. That strength, that same strength, it's the coercion dilemma, right? Yeah. And so that same strength could be used in a variety of ways. And these other Gulf states look at that, and especially with the attack in Qatar, is that, they weren't all that displeased with the weakening of Iran, right, when it was unleashed on them. But then when it comes to them, to their place, it becomes a threat.
Well, and part of this discussion in the last couple of weeks is Saudi Arabia has moved closer to Pakistan. Right. And there's security agreements between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And some people say this is now Saudi Arabia beginning the process of balancing against Israel.
Against Israel, right. And so yeah, there's a lot going on.
Yeah, and all of this, and we got to finish here, but all of this depends on whether this peace holds. And hopefully we've given you a sense about how challenging the next set of the peace process will be.
Right.
I think we need to finish by emphasizing the fragility of this. There's a lot of there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about this process today, but we shouldn't underestimate the risk that this thing could fall apart. There's a lot of hard work left to do in the peace process.
Well, and how does it fall apart is through more violence, right? Yeah. And so that's and controlling the violence is a hard thing to do. I mean, those people around the table that make agreements and sign the papers, they don't necessarily control the actors on the ground, and that's a big problem as well.
This is why this international stabilization force is going to be so important, right? Are the regional players in the United States going to be willing to put boots on the ground to create a stable police force and a peace in Gaza?
And it's going to be more than a peacekeeping force. I mean, it could see some.
It's going to have to be. It's probably going to have to be a disarmament force.
Yeah.
So
I think that's enough.
Yeah. Stay tuned. We're guessing we'll probably end up talking about this in one of our last two sessions. As always, if you have questions, please reach out to us.
Well, we appreciate it. This is a tough topic to talk about. I'm glad we can do that. So, all right.
Have a good one and reach out to us with any questions.